It's dawn, April 19th, 1775. On a small Massachusetts green, 77 farmers and shopkeepers stand in the cold, clutching whatever muskets they could find. Marching toward them are 700 professional British soldiers, a wall of red moving through the mist. Their commander, John Parker, knows the math. He knows this isn't a fight they can win. He gives a strict order: stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. The British advance guard stops. They order the militia to disperse. Parker, seeing the hopeless odds, tells his men to fall back. And right at that moment, a shot rings out. That single bullet instantly transformed a localized political dispute into an open war. To understand why this morning on the Green was inevitable, we have to look at the economic and social pressures building since the end of the 7 Years' War. A few years earlier, Britain fought the massive and massively expensive French and Indian War. The empire needed cash to pay off its debts, so Parliament decided to tax their 13 American colonies. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. The levies piled up. The colonists' grievance was straightforward. They had no voice in the British Parliament. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry against a government unilaterally extracting their wealth. The resistance hit a boiling point in 1773. Colonists boarded British ships and dumped a massive cargo of imported tea straight into Boston Harbor, destroying British property. Parliament retaliated with a heavy hand, passing laws the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston's port, stripped Massachusetts of self-government, and placed it under military occupation. Massachusetts residents stopped protesting and started preparing. Ordinary citizens formed militias, adopting the name Minutemen because they could be ready to fight in 60 seconds. In towns outside Boston, they quietly began stockpiling gunpowder and weapons. The British military governor, General Thomas Gage, caught wind of these secret armories. On the night of April 18th, he sent 700 troops marching out of Boston under the cover of darkness to seize the munitions. But colonial intelligence was already one step ahead. Riders like Paul Revere and William Dawes raced ahead of the column on horseback, frantically waking the countryside. As church bells rang and riders galloped through the dark, the element of surprise evaporated. By the time the British column reached Lexington, they weren't catching a sleeping countryside off guard. They were walking straight into a mobilized, armed populace waiting for them in the dawn mist. Which brings us back to that tense standoff on Lexington Green. For 2.5 centuries, historians have debated who fired that very first shot. Was it a twitchy British soldier? A militiaman behind a tavern window? The evidence remains completely inconclusive, but the consequence of that shot was immediate. Within seconds, the disciplined British regulars opened fire, unleashing a devastating volley directly into the scattered ranks of the militia. The skirmish was over in minutes. 8 colonists lay dead on the grass. 10 more were wounded. The British sustained only a single minor injury, reformed their lines, and continued their march toward their main target in Concord. On paper, it was a swift, overwhelming tactical victory for the Redcoats. Yet by spilling civilian blood, they crossed an irreversible line. The political debate over taxes died on Lexington Green, replaced by an armed uprising. When the British troops finally arrived in Concord to seize the stockpiled weapons, they found almost nothing. Thanks to the Midnight Riders' warnings, the colonists had already dispersed and hidden the bulk of their munitions. Meanwhile, hundreds of militiamen from surrounding towns had converged on Concord. They gathered on a hillside overlooking a small British detachment guarding the town's north bridge. This time, the numbers were reversed. The militia advanced down the hill, and the two sides exchanged fire. Outnumbered and outflanked at the river crossing, the British regulars broke and retreated. This exact moment at the bridge is widely considered the true shot heard round the world. American colonists had organized, stood their ground, and actively forced the King's army backward. Now, the British faced a harrowing 18-mile march back to the safety of Boston. Thousands of militiamen took up hidden positions behind stone walls, trees, and barns lining the route. To survive it, the British relied on traditional doctrine, moving as a dense, centralized column on the road. The colonists chose a different approach. They would fire into the Redcoats, then melt away before the British could mount an organized counterattack. The British Army was trained for open-field, regiment-to-regiment combat. They were entirely unprepared for decentralized guerrilla warfare. By refusing to fight on European terms, the colonial farmers stripped away the empire's tactical advantages and turned the retreat into a bloody gauntlet. This chart visualizes the final casualty counts from that long retreat. By the time the exhausted British column reached Boston, they had suffered 73 dead and around 200 wounded or missing. The colonial forces lost 49 men. The psychological impact of those numbers echoed across the Atlantic. An elite, globally feared military machine had just been severely battered by a localized network of tradesmen and farmers. As the British retreated behind their defenses in Boston, the landscape behind them continued to fill. Word of the fighting traveled faster than the troops, and by evening, thousands of armed men from across New England had arrived at the city limits. They dug trenches and established a perimeter that trapped the British military inside their own headquarters. The political gears turned just as fast. News of the fighting spread, and within weeks, the Second Continental Congress took formal control of these citizen militias, officially establishing the Continental Army and appointing a Virginian named George Washington to lead it. The War for Independence started here, not in a legislative hall, but on a village green, triggered by a single unclaimed gunshot. Morning breaks over Boston on June 17, 1775. As British General William Howe looks out from the city, he sees a heavily fortified earthen wall sitting right on top of Breed's Hill. It had not been there the day before. He makes a quick calculation. Howe commands thousands of highly disciplined professional soldiers. To him, the solution is obvious. March straight up the hill in tight formation and take the position by sheer force. But how did a militia of untrained farmers manage to build a fortress entirely undetected? Why did a seasoned British general choose to walk his men directly into an uphill crossfire? And how did a few hours on this hill chart the course of the American Revolution? Howe's reliance on traditional European military tactics clouded his judgment. He assumed a show of overwhelming professional force would make an amateur militia run. He was walking into a trap of his own making. This map shows Boston and its harbor in 1775, essentially an island connected by a narrow strip. North sits the Charlestown Peninsula, with significant elevation. If colonial forces placed cannons on those heights, the British Navy below would be sitting ducks. On the night of June 16th, colonial orders were to secure Bunker Hill, but Colonel William Prescott, leading a force of 1,200 militiamen, made a rogue call. He pushed his men forward to Breed's Hill, aggressively close to the British guns. Working in complete darkness, the men dug for their lives. Using picks and shovels, they moved tons of earth to construct a formidable defensive redoubt, racing to finish before the sun came up and exposed their position. By placing his fort right in the face of the British forces, Prescott forced Howe's hand. The colonial militia was too close to ignore. The British had to remove them, and they had to do it in broad daylight. By early afternoon, Howe's men begin their ascent. They march under the summer sun in their bright red coats, stepping to the beat of drums in perfect, unyielding lines. The British High Command expects this visual alone to do the heavy lifting. In European warfare, amateur troops usually scatter when confronted by a wall of advancing bayonets. Here is the stark resource reality. Left, thousands of British targets. Right, the militia's limited gunpowder. They couldn't fire at will. To compensate, every shot must connect. Holding fire until seeing the whites of their eyes was mathematical. As distance shrinks, hit probability spikes. This initial clash is entirely dictated by these opposing strategies. The British rely on overwhelming psychological pressure, while the colonists execute extreme, calculated resource conservation. The colonists wait until the redcoats are within 50 paces, and then they fire all at once. The impact is catastrophic. Entire rows of British regulars collapse, turning their perfectly ordered ranks into chaotic fragments. The survivors retreat, reform, and try again, only to be shredded by a second volley. Down below, the British officers watch in disbelief. In a matter of minutes, hundreds of their most elite professional soldiers are killed or wounded by a ragtag force of civilians. General Howe orders a third desperate charge up the hill, but this time the colonial supply of powder and shot finally empties out. The guns fall silent. With nothing left to shoot, the militia resort to throwing rocks and swinging the heavy wooden stocks of their muskets. The battle degrades into brutal hand-to-hand combat as the British swarm over the earthen walls. The British take the hill, but only because the colonists ran out of ammunition. The defensive strategy held. The math just ran dry before the redcoats did. By the end of the afternoon on June 17th, the physical objective is achieved. The British force captures Breed's Hill, and the Union Jack flies over the Charlestown Peninsula. But this bar chart reveals the devastating cost of that real estate. When we compare the sheer volume of casualties, the British suffer over 1,000 killed or wounded. That's nearly half their attacking force. Colonial losses sit around 450. If these loss ratios are projected forward onto future battles, the British military presence in North America will simply bleed out. When this data reaches London, it causes widespread panic. For General Howe, the reality is stark. They cannot afford to fight at this rate. For the colonists, this staggering body count serves as a lethal proof of concept. They now have undeniable evidence that farmers and tradesmen, armed with hunting weapons and a defensive advantage, can stand toe-to-toe with a global superpower and exact a terrible toll. That realization hardens the militia's resolve. The psychological boost sustains them through the long, freezing months of the Boston Siege, ultimately forcing the British to evacuate the city the following March. The afternoon on Breed's Hill proves that neither side is going to fold easily. The British learned the heavy price of American territory, and the colonists realize they can actually survive the fight. This mutual understanding guarantees a long, brutal conflict, one that will inevitably escalate onto the global stage at a place called Saratoga. On October 17, 1777, British General John Burgoyne did something no British commander had done before in this conflict. He walked onto a field in New York and surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 professional soldiers, to a force of colonial militia. This was a total capitulation. An entire imperial army laid down its weapons and marched off the field as prisoners of war. So how did the world's greatest military power get trapped in the New York woods? Why did a meticulously planned invasion fall apart so quickly? And how did this single isolated surrender pull the rest of the world into the fight? The collapse at Saratoga was a fatal blow to British imperial strategy. It broke their grip on the colonies and set off a chain reaction that pulled rival superpowers into the fight. To see how it went wrong, we have to rewind to earlier in 1777. 2 years into the war, the British desperately needed a decisive victory. The Battle of Bunker Hill had already taught them that marching in straight lines against entrenched colonial militia was too bloody and too slow. Looking at this historical map, their objective was the Hudson River, acting as a physical dividing line through New York. A massive pincer movement was designed, General Burgoyne pushing south from Canada, another force east, and General Howe north, converging on Albany simultaneously. On paper, this plan was brilliant. By securing that river line, Britain would isolate New England completely, starving the heart of the rebellion of all outside support and crushing it from the outside in. But this animated diagram shows how quickly the reality on the ground fell apart. Instead of marching north, General Howe pivoted toward Philadelphia to chase George Washington. Meanwhile, the western thrust hit fierce resistance and was forced into a full retreat. That left Burgoyne marching south from Canada completely alone. And he was commanding a massive, slow-moving, European-style army. His column was weighed down by heavy artillery, sprawling supply trains, and his own extensive personal luxuries, all dragging through an untamed, heavily forested wilderness. The colonial militia exploited every inch of that geography. They felled massive trees across the narrow dirt roads, burned the bridges ahead of the British advance, and picked off soldiers from the tree line in constant guerrilla ambushes. Every single mile Burgoyne advanced cost him something he could not replace. He was bleeding time, losing men, and burning through essential supplies. A flawless theoretical invasion was dismantled by rogue commanders and brutal geography, turning a confident march into a grueling logistical death march. By the time Burgoyne's exhausted and starving force reached the area near Saratoga in September, they found General Horatio Gates waiting for them. And Gates's American army was only growing larger as local militia poured in from the surrounding countryside. The two sides collided at Freeman's Farm. American forces, relying heavily on riflemen and sharpshooters, heavily targeted the British command structure. They inflicted devastating casualties on British officers before finally giving up the physical ground. The climax came weeks later in early October at the Battle of Bemis Heights. Burgoyne was heavily outnumbered and launched a desperate, sprawling attack to try and break out of the American encirclement. His lines were ultimately shattered. Benedict Arnold, defying direct orders, led a chaotic, reckless charge that tore right through the key British defensive positions. The aftermath was absolute. Burgoyne's army was entirely surrounded. Their retreat lines back to Canada were blocked, they were entirely out of food, and on October 17th, they surrendered. The physical trapping and capture of a massive British army in the woods of New York shattered the enduring myth of British invincibility in North America. The most important reaction to this surrender happened across the Atlantic, in Paris. The French had been quietly funneling covert money and weapons to the Americans for a while, staying officially out of sight. King Louis XVI's government was highly pragmatic. They refused to openly commit French military forces to a colonial rebellion that was statistically likely to collapse at any moment. Then, the news of Saratoga arrived on their desks. This was the undeniable proof of concept France demanded. It proved the Americans were actually capable of capturing an entire British army, giving France the perfect, calculated opportunity to strike back at Britain and avenge their own past military defeats. Within months, the diplomatic dominoes fell. France formally recognized American independence and signed a military treaty of alliance. The most critical asset France brought to the fight was a powerful navy. For the first time, the colonies had an allied fleet, capable of actively challenging British dominion over the oceans. As we can see on this map, the conflict immediately expanded. Following France's lead, Spain and the Dutch Republic soon entered the fight, dropping new battlefronts across Europe, the Caribbean, and India. A localized rebellion exploded into a multi-theater global war. Before Saratoga, the Americans were an isolated group of colonists hoping to simply outlast an empire. After Saratoga, they were backed by global superpowers, immense financial resources, and fully equipped militaries. Saratoga earns its title as the turning point of the revolution because it forged a credible global path to victory. It was the catalyst that set the stage for the final British surrender on a field in Yorktown. In September 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis stood near the edge of the Chesapeake Bay. He was looking toward the horizon, waiting for the arrival of the Royal Navy to provide a route for retreat. Ships did appear, but as the colors on the masts came into focus, Cornwallis realized they were French. His army was cut off from the sea. An experienced, aggressive commander had backed his entire army onto a tiny strip of land with no exit. To understand how a fragmented rebellion coordinated a multinational trap to end a 6-year war, we have to look at the geography of the Virginia coast. By 1781, the conflict had expanded into a global struggle between empires. British strategy had shifted to the American South, where Cornwallis fought a series of engagements through the Carolinas that left his forces depleted and his resources exhausted. Low on men and supplies, Cornwallis needed a secure port to recover his strength, a move that would lead him directly into a catastrophic miscalculation. Cornwallis moved his army into Virginia and established a fortified base at the port town of Yorktown. On paper, the position was sound. Yorktown sits on a peninsula, allowing Cornwallis to dig defensive trenches across the narrow land while the Navy protected his rear. He planned to hold this ground and wait for reinforcements by sea. This strategy relied entirely on the assumption that the sea would remain a British lifeline. George Washington and French commander Comte de Rochambeau recognized that Cornwallis's reliance on the sea was actually a fatal vulnerability. They executed a rapid, secretive movement of 17,000 combined troops. This phantom march bypassed northern British strongholds, heading toward Virginia. Simultaneously, Admiral de Grasse's French fleet sailed up from the Caribbean to block the Chesapeake Bay. At the Battle of the Chesapeake, the French Navy defeated the British fleet and pushed them out of the bay. Cornwallis's path to resupply or evacuation was gone. By coordinating these movements across hundreds of miles of land and sea, the Allied forces turned the Yorktown Peninsula into an inescapable prison. General Cornwallis was trapped with 7,000 men. Closing in on him was an Allied force of 17,000, outnumbering his army 2-1. The Allies began a methodical siege, digging trenches that moved their artillery closer to British lines each day. This process was designed to grind down the defenders, while minimizing losses for the attacking infantry. Constant artillery bombardment and spreading disease, a lack of food and ammunition, broke their ability to resist. By mid-October, coordinated night assaults overran the outer British defenses, including a bayonet charge led by Alexander Hamilton. The siege functioned as a mechanical constriction, stripping the British army of the space and resources it needed to fight, until surrender was the only remaining option. On October 17, 1781, 4 years to the day after the British surrender at Saratoga, Cornwallis requested terms. 2 days later, 8,000 British and Hessian troops marched out to lay down their weapons. A humiliated Cornwallis sent his subordinate, General Charles O'Hara, to deliver his sword to the victors. While small skirmishes continued elsewhere, the capture of this major army effectively ended the British military campaign in North America. In London, the news of the surrender brought Prime Minister Lord North to a state of despair. The British Parliament realized the war had become too expensive to sustain. Domestic support for the conflict collapsed, leading quickly to the start of peace negotiations. These negotiations produced the 1783 Treaty of Paris. In the first article, the British Crown formally recognized the independence of the United States. Independence was won by forcing the financial and political cost of the war higher than the British government was willing to pay. Yorktown was the moment the British Empire decided the 13 colonies were no longer worth the price of the struggle. But while the war was legally over, the news of peace traveled slowly. In our next episode, we look at the Battle of New Orleans, a major engagement fought after the war had already technically ended.
January 8, 1815. A muddy field in southern Louisiana is torn apart by heavy artillery as thousands of veteran British soldiers march directly into a wall of American fire. Within 30 minutes, over 2,000 British soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. American losses, by comparison, are estimated at under 100. It was one of the most lopsided wins in American military history, and it had absolutely no effect on the outcome of the war, because on paper, the war was already over. How did thousands of men march to their deaths in a conflict that no longer technically existed? And how did a victory that changed nothing about the peace treaty manage to change so much about the country's future? Before this morning, the War of 1812 had been a frustrating, often embarrassing conflict for the United States. The military had struggled for years, and the British had even managed to invade Washington, D.C. and burn it to the ground.
By late 1814, the country was exhausted. To many Americans, New Orleans represented a final chance to salvage national pride and close out the fighting with a clear, undeniable win. Over in Europe, a resolution had already been reached. Diplomats from both sides sat down in Ghent, Belgium, and on December 24, 1814, they signed a formal peace treaty. But in 1814, there was no telegraph or radio. News traveled by ship, and ships took weeks to cross the Atlantic. This map tracks the week-by-week journey. The treaty sat in a ship's hold, slowly creeping toward America. Meanwhile, a massive British invasion force was already moving. Their target was New Orleans, a port they hoped to seize as a bargaining chip before peace was finalized. This lack of communication created a lethal blind spot. The gears of war were engaged, and a major collision was guaranteed before the news of peace could arrive. Tasked with defending the city was Andrew Jackson, a tough frontier commander leading a vastly outnumbered force against veteran British troops. To hold the line, Jackson pulled together a diverse coalition: regular army soldiers, the state militia, free black soldiers, and Choctaw warriors. He even recruited a group of local pirates and smugglers led by Jean Lafitte, offering them full pardons in exchange for their help in the defense. Jackson anchored this force behind earthworks and cotton bales, positioning his heavy artillery to create devastating fields of crossfire for anyone attempting to cross the open ground. The British assault failed almost immediately. In the chaos of the retreat, their commander, General Edward Pakenham, was killed on the battlefield. It was a tactical humiliation. A scrappy, unconventional American force had dismantled one of the most professional militaries in the world. Weeks after the battle, the ship carrying the treaty finally docked in America. The war was officially over, rendering the entire engagement technically moot. The victory at New Orleans didn't change a single word of the agreement. On paper, nothing had changed. But when news of the win reached a public still reeling from the burning of Washington, the national mood shifted. The war didn't just end in a stalemate. It closed with a clear triumph that the country used to reclaim its confidence. This outcome helped fuel a new self-image, the story of the scrappy underdog who could outsmart and outfight a global superpower. For Andrew Jackson personally, the battle was transformative. He became a celebrated national hero overnight, gaining a level of fame that followed him for the rest of his life. That fame provided the momentum for a political career that eventually carried him to the presidency and shaped the next era of American politics. Thousands of men fought and died for a war that no longer existed, simply because news could not travel fast enough. Yet that accidental conflict provided the exact kind of mythic victory the American public was looking for. In the next part of this series, we head to Texas, to a small mission surrounded by an overwhelming enemy force. 200 men, 13 days, and a line in the sand. The Alamo. On February 23, 1836, the Mexican army arrived outside a small Spanish mission in Texas. They didn't ask for a surrender. Instead, they raised a blood-red flag. In the military code of the day, that color meant one thing: no quarter, no prisoners. Inside that mission, Colonel William Travis understood the message. According to the accounts that survived, he drew a line in the dirt with his sword and asked every man willing to stay and fight to the death to step across it. Nearly every one of the 200 men inside did exactly that. What followed was a complete military slaughter. Every fighting man inside those walls was killed. Yet that total defeat is credited with securing the eventual Texan victory in the war. Curious, why did 200 men choose to stay in a trap they knew they couldn't survive? And how did a tactical failure of this scale lead to a change in the borders of North America? To understand the Alamo, we have to look past the frontier mythology and examine how the specific mechanics of a massacre served a broader strategic purpose. By the 1830s, the Mexican territory of Texas was experiencing a massive demographic shift. American settlers were pouring across the border, drawn by the promise of cheap land and economic opportunity. As the population grew, so did the friction. These new settlers wanted more local autonomy and resisted the central authority of Mexico City. At the same time, the Mexican government grew suspicious of a region filling up with people whose loyalties were unproven. This tension caught the attention of Mexican President and General Antonio López de Santa Anna. He was an authoritarian leader who immediately mobilized a professional army to march north and end the uprising. By deciding to personally lead thousands of troops to crush a local rebellion, Santa Anna ensured the conflict would escalate. He was either going to extinguish the Texan cause immediately or give the rebels a reason to radicalize their movement. The Alamo was never built to hold off a professional army. It was an old Spanish mission designed to house monks and local converts, not soldiers. Its walls were thick, but the layout was a sprawling plaza. To defend a perimeter of that size, you need a massive garrison. The Texans only had about 200 men, forcing them to spread thin just to cover the basic defensive positions. Outside, Santa Anna commanded a force several thousand strong. The defenders were outnumbered by more than 10 to 1. From a purely tactical perspective, the Alamo was a trap. The men inside were standing in a position they couldn't possibly hold, making their decision to stay a sacrifice of their lives,
rather than a viable military defense of the building. The siege lasted 13 days. The Mexican army systematically surrounded the compound, cutting off all escape routes while slowly advancing their artillery lines to batter the mission's stone walls. The defenders smuggled out requests for reinforcements, but only 32 men managed to slip through the Mexican lines. It was nowhere near the numbers required to change the odds against Santa Anna's force. In the early morning hours of March 6th, the Mexican army launched its final assault. Troops stormed the mission, breaching the walls from multiple directions at once and pouring into the courtyard. The defenders fought room by room, but within a few hours, nearly every man inside was dead. Santa Anna suffered several hundred casualties of his own, a high price for defeating a garrison of only 200. Santa Anna believed this display of force would crush the Texan spirit. He didn't anticipate that the story of the massacre would provide his enemies with a more powerful motivation to fight than they had before. When news of the slaughter spread, it didn't inspire the fear Santa Anna had intended. Instead, it enraged the surviving settlers. The story of the siege turned the lost defenders into a symbol of resistance. Just over a month later, Texan forces under General Sam Houston caught the Mexican army by surprise at the Battle of San Jacinto. As the Texans charged, they used a new rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo." The actual fighting lasted only about 18 minutes before the Mexican lines broke. The victory was the result of a tactical surprise and the extremely high aggression of the Texan troops, who were driven by news of the previous month's massacre. The fallout of San Jacinto was immediate. Santa Anna was captured the next day and forced to recognize the independence of the Republic of Texas. This map shows the resulting borders of the Texas Republic, setting the stage for it to join the United States. That annexation sparked the Mexican-American War, determining if New Mexico, California, and the American West would become U.S. territory. A mission built for monks was a poor fortress, but by holding an indefensible position, those 200 men gave the independence movement a story that outlasted the battle, helping to set the borders of the modern American West. On February 23, 1847, in the dusty mountains of northern Mexico, General Zachary Taylor's defensive line is buckling under intense, extreme pressure. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna has thrown a hardened army of 20,000 men against a desperate, outnumbered force of just 4,700 American volunteers. The American position is tearing apart. Casualties are mounting rapidly, and the front line is mere moments away from total collapse. Yet, whether this single defensive line holds or shatters will determine who controls the final borders of the American West. By 1846, a bitter border dispute over Texas and the drive for westward expansion pushed the U.S. and Mexico into open war. But the next year, Washington suddenly shifted strategy, pulling Taylor's veteran troops south toward Mexico City. Mexican leadership recognizes the vulnerability. Santa Anna immediately marches his massive force north, gambling that he can crush the weakened American army before any reinforcements arrive. By pivoting their grand strategy, American commanders accidentally engineered a terrifying vacuum, trapping a small, largely untrained militia in a massive battle they were never equipped to fight. Instead of attempting a doomed retreat, Taylor decides to stake his army's survival on a specific piece of terrain near a hacienda called Buena Vista. Looking at this 3D model of the pass, jagged mountains and impassable ravines create a severe natural bottleneck. This geography neutralizes the Mexican army's size advantage. Santa Anna cannot stretch his lines, forcing his massive forces to compress into a narrow, ineffective formation. For 2 grueling days, wave after wave of Mexican infantry and cavalry crash into the choke point, relentlessly probing the American lines for any physical weakness. While the rough terrain prevents immediate destruction, the sheer mathematical weight and exhaustion of blocking a continuous assault pushes the American volunteers to their absolute limit. By day 2, volunteer units finally fracture under the intense pressure, tearing dangerous, gaping holes in the American defense. Survival comes down to one ultimate tactical countermeasure. Skilled American artillery crews haul their cannons into the breaches, firing devastating close-range blasts directly into the advancing Mexican ranks. One artillery officer, Captain Braxton Bragg,
executes a series of aggressive, last-minute barrages that successfully plug the collapsing gaps at the most critical moments. The combination of the geographic bottleneck and continuous shrapnel inflicts a catastrophic human toll on the tightly packed Mexican formations. Despite still heavily outnumbering the Americans, the staggering losses force Santa Anna into a corner. Overnight, he abruptly withdraws his army and retreats south. The precise application of rugged terrain and artillery fire allowed a skeleton crew of volunteers to survive an overwhelming onslaught and permanently halt the Mexican counteroffensive. Buena Vista was a purely defensive stand, yet its strategic effect was terminal for Mexico. The victory permanently secured United States control over the Northern Territory and broke the Mexican military's momentum. Leveraging that momentum, American forces push all the way to Mexico City by September 1847, forcing a devastated Mexican government to surrender. The conflict formally concludes in 1848 with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The terms are staggering. Mexico is forced to cede an enormous stretch of land, instantly expanding the United States by roughly 500,000 square miles. This map shows the exact land transfer, carving out the future borders of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and most of Arizona. Back east, the political fallout is immediate. Zachary Taylor's reputation as the general who held the line against impossible odds wins him the presidency just 2 years later. A desperate stand in an isolated mountain pass served as the geopolitical anvil on which a coast-to-coast American empire was forged. Next time, America turns its weapons on itself. The Civil War brings our bloodiest day and a new purpose: Antietam. September 1862. An abandoned meadow in Maryland. A Union soldier spots something strange on the ground. A small bundle of 3 cigars, wrapped tightly in a piece of paper. That paper is Special Order 191, the highly classified invasion plans drafted by Confederate General Robert E. Lee. How exactly does a misplaced piece of paper trigger the bloodiest day in American military history? And how does the resulting battle, ending in a frustrating stalemate, manage to rewrite the core purpose of the war? In this moment, the future of international diplomacy and the lives of millions of enslaved people came to rest on a stray bundle of cigars. By this point, the conflict has been grinding on for a year and a half. The Confederate Army, riding a wave of victories, decides to cross out of Virginia and invade the North. The goal is to shatter the Union's will to fight. If Lee can secure a decisive win on Northern soil, he might force a peace treaty and convince European powers, like Britain and France, to officially recognize the Confederacy. Down in Washington, President Abraham Lincoln faces his own political trap. He has drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that would free enslaved people in rebel territory. But he is paralyzed by a string of recent military defeats. Releasing the document while the Union Army is losing would look like a desperate plea for help. To release it with authority, Lincoln strictly requires a battlefield win. The legal freedom of millions of enslaved people rests entirely on whatever happens next between these two armies. Thanks to that dropped cigar wrapper, Union General George McClellan knows exactly where Lee's forces are, yet McClellan hesitates, moving his troops with excruciating caution. That delay buys Lee precious time. He uses those hours to pull his scattered regiments together, forming a defensive line near the Maryland town of Sharpsburg, right along the winding banks of Antietam Creek. On the morning of September 17, 1862, the two massive armies finally collide. The fighting erupts in a 24-acre cornfield on the northern edge of the battlefield. Soldiers fire at point-blank range through the tall stalks. The acreage is so fiercely contested that it changes hands over and over again throughout the morning. The sheer volume of incoming fire instantly renders standard military maneuvers useless. Entire regiments are cut down simultaneously, with men falling dead in neat rows as if harvested by a scythe. By midday, the combat shifts south to a sunken farm road. Confederate troops use the depressed dirt path as a ready-made trench, crouching behind the wooden fences to fire. Union forces mount wave after wave of frontal assaults against this fortified position, marching directly into a concentrated, devastating crossfire. The ensuing slaughter is staggering. Over the next 3 hours, thousands of men are gunned down in this tiny stretch of land, literally filling the ditches with bodies and permanently branding the site Bloody Lane. The natural geography that provided shelter to the defenders ultimately traps them, funneling horrific amounts of lead into a narrow, inescapable trench. In the afternoon, the focal point moves again. Union troops, commanded by General Ambrose Burnside, are ordered to cross Antietam Creek, but they have to funnel across a narrow stone bridge. A few hundred Confederates positioned on the high bluffs on the opposite side pin down thousands of Union soldiers under heavy fire, creating a lethal bottleneck that lasts for hours. When the guns go quiet that evening, the numbers defy comprehension. Roughly 23,000 men are dead, wounded, or missing. To put this in perspective, this single-day casualty count exceeds the American losses during the D-Day landings decades later. Despite the overwhelming carnage, the battle is effectively a draw. Lee's battered army survives the bloodbath and eventually retreats back to Virginia, largely because McClellan refuses to pursue them. The most lethal 24 hours in American military history closes with a tense, exhausted standoff. Neither side definitively commands the field, but a tactical draw in Maryland translates to a massive strategic victory in Washington. By stopping the Northern invasion, the Union slams the door on Lee's ultimate objective. Without a decisive victory on Northern soil, Britain and France refuse to formally recognize the Confederacy. This Confederate retreat gives Abraham Lincoln exactly what he needs. It is close enough to a victory that he can act without appearing desperate. This document is the Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Issued just 5 days after the battle, it declares that all enslaved people in states still actively in rebellion will be legally free. The catastrophic human cost of September 17th generates the specific political capital required to push this legislation forward. Lincoln's order immediately rewrites the terms of the conflict. The war officially became a fight to dismantle the institution of slavery, rather than a struggle focused solely on borderlines and maps. The 23,000 casualties at Antietam forced the administration to define the preservation of the Union through the lens of human emancipation. The war now carries an entirely different weight. And in the next episode, that weight bears down on a small Pennsylvania town, where the survival of the United States will be tested over 3 brutal days at Gettysburg. On July 3, 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee issued an order that defied standard military doctrine. He sent 12,500 men advancing across a mile of open field, marching steadily into the direct fire of entrenched Union artillery. It is a scene almost impossible to imagine surviving. The question remains, why would a seasoned military strategist commit his army to an assault with such a low probability of success? And how did a chance meeting at a Pennsylvania crossroads decide the ultimate fate of the United States? This charge was the final, desperate move in a chain of decisions that would eventually break the Confederacy's ability to wage an offensive war. By the summer of 1863, the war had entered its 3rd brutal year. In the east, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was coming off a stunning victory at Chancellorsville. Lee sought to carry that momentum onto Union soil. His primary military objectives were to relieve the pressure on Virginia's depleted farmland and to directly threaten major northern cities like Washington and Philadelphia. There was a political calculation as well. Lee believed a victory in the North would empower anti-war factions, forcing a negotiated peace. Lee launched the Pennsylvania campaign as an all-or-nothing gamble, intended to force an immediate end to the conflict through a single decisive blow. The two massive armies collided in late June near a small crossroads town called Gettysburg, a location that neither commander had originally chosen for a major engagement. As reinforcements arrived on July 1, Confederate forces gained the upper hand, driving Union troops back through the streets of town. This initial victory had an unintended consequence. The retreating Union soldiers regrouped on the dominant high ground just south of town, occupying a naturally strong defensive line along Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. By pushing the Union Army onto this ridge, the Confederates handed their enemy a defensive advantage that would dictate the remainder of the battle. On the second day, Lee attempted to break the Union position by launching heavy assaults against both ends of their line, the flanks. Combat erupted at close range across locations that would become synonymous with the battle's violence: Little Round Top, the wheat field, and the peach orchard. The fighting was characterized by hours of desperate, localized engagements that left thousands dead among the rocks and fields. Despite these repeated assaults, the Union line held. By the end of July 2, the Confederate attempts to turn the flanks had failed at an enormous cost. Lee, however, remained convinced that the Union center must have been weakened to reinforce the flanks, leading him to his most fateful decision. Lee acted on this assumption on the third day, ordering a massive infantry strike directly at the center of the Union position, Pickett's charge. The plan required 12,500 men to converge on a single, heavily fortified point. They had to cross nearly a mile of open ground under constant fire from Union artillery positioned on the heights. The assault reached the Union line briefly before it collapsed under the weight of the defensive fire. In less than an hour, nearly half of the Confederate soldiers who took part were killed, wounded, or captured. With his offensive capacity exhausted, Lee began a retreat into Virginia on July 4th, ending the Confederate invasion of the North. The 3 days at Gettysburg resulted in 50,000 combined casualties, the highest toll of any single battle in the war. On the same day Lee retreated, Union forces far to the west captured the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg. These simultaneous victories gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and ended the threat of yet another Confederate invasion, shifting the strategic momentum of the entire war in the Union's favor. In November of 1863, President Abraham Lincoln arrived at the battlefield to dedicate a cemetery for those who had fallen. During his brief remarks, known as the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln articulated a new understanding of the conflict's purpose. He defined the war as a test of whether a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could survive. While the fighting continued for 2 more years, Gettysburg provided the military success necessary to preserve the Union and the political foundation to redefine its moral goals. In our next episode, we jump forward decades to a hillside charge in Cuba that turned a soldier into a national hero and, eventually, a president. The Caribbean heat is suffocating, and the incoming rifle fire is devastating. On July 1, 1898, American infantrymen are pushing blindly up a steep, sweltering slope in Cuba, taking heavy losses from an entrenched Spanish defense they can barely see through the smoke. Through this chaotic, poorly coordinated assault rides a man wearing wire-rimmed glasses. He is on horseback, fully exposed to the enemy guns, leading a ragtag column of volunteers straight toward the high ground. This brief, disorganized window of combat broke a centuries-old global empire into pieces and propelled that bespectacled man on the horse straight to the White House. The combat on that hillside launched 2 distinct shifts: the sudden expansion of the American map and the rapid political rise of the man who led the charge. To see how it happened, we have to look at the exact moment the borders began to move. By early 1898, the United States is strictly bound by its own coastlines. It is a regional power with its political and military focus turned firmly inward toward the North American continent. Just 90 miles to the south, however, Spain is violently suppressing a local rebellion in its colony of Cuba. The violence dominates American newspapers, and public outrage grows steadily for months. Then, in February, a mysterious explosion rips through the hull of the American battleship USS Maine while it sits anchored in Havana Harbor, killing over 260 sailors. The exact cause of the blast is never conclusively proven, but the press seizes the tragedy immediately. Editors print sensational headlines blaming the Spanish military, whipping their readers into a pro-war frenzy. By April, Congress declares war on Spain. The sudden shift into armed conflict opened a vacuum for ambitious leaders like Theodore Roosevelt to test American military might on foreign soil. Roosevelt is serving as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the war begins. Refusing to sit out a fight, he quickly resigns his comfortable Washington desk job to seek active combat. He helps form and personally leads a new unit, the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. Nicknamed the Rough Riders, it is an unconventional mix of Ivy League elites, cowboys, and frontiersmen eager to join the fray. By late June, American forces land in Cuba. Their primary objective is the city of Santiago de Cuba, a vital port that shelters the Spanish fleet. Capturing the city means crippling Spain's naval presence in the hemisphere, but the army cannot simply march into Santiago. Standing directly between the American lines and the city is a steep, heavily fortified ridgeline, anchored by two key defensive positions, Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. The July 1 assault on those hills is a tactical mess. Regiments wait completely exposed to enemy fire as they trudge forward through wet, entirely open ground, dropping in alarming numbers under heavy Spanish rifle volleys. Frustrated by the stalled advance, Roosevelt breaks from the confusion. He rallies his Rough Riders and initiates a charge directly up Kettle Hill, riding his horse in plain view of the Spanish guns, while his men scramble up the steep slope beside him. The fighting is vicious. In a matter of hours, the American forces overwhelm the defenders and secure Kettle Hill, though they suffer heavy casualties relative to the short duration of the battle. While Roosevelt takes Kettle Hill, adjacent American units push through fierce resistance to capture San Juan Hill itself. Together, these victories hand the United States the critical high ground overlooking Santiago. The Spanish garrison is now trapped. 2 days later, their fleet attempts a desperate breakout from the harbor, but the awaiting U.S. Navy intercepts the ships, obliterating them until each vessel is left a burned-out husk. The collapse of the ridge defenses breaks the back of the Spanish resistance. Cut off from naval support and surrounded on the high ground, Santiago surrenders on July 17th, wrapping up the major land fighting in mere weeks. By August, Spain formally seeks peace. The resulting treaty is devastating to the Spanish crown, stripping away nearly all of its remaining imperial territories. The agreement grants Cuba independence, while Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines are ceded to United States control. This treaty stretches American dominion thousands of miles outward, planting flags deep in the Caribbean and across the vast Pacific. In a matter of months, the isolationist borders of 1898 are erased. The United States has now officially acquired an overseas empire, taking a permanent seat at the table of global powers. Meanwhile, domestic newspapers elevate the Kettle Hill charge into an American myth. They plaster Roosevelt's name across front pages, cementing his reputation as a fearless man of action. Roosevelt converts that military fame straight into political momentum. Within 12 months, voters elect him governor of New York. By the following year, he is sworn in as Vice President of the United States. Then, in September 1901, President William McKinley is assassinated, forcing an abrupt transfer of executive power. Roosevelt takes the oath of office at just 42 years old. To this day, he remains the youngest person to ever assume the presidency. The charge up San Juan's Hill forged a new American empire, spanning 2 oceans, and created the political momentum for the leader who would guide it into a new century.